And that's why the sermon is short, because that says it all. And that's exactly the kind of community, there you go, sweetie, that we are creating here. A community where we have nothing to prove and absolutely nothing to lose and nothing to hide. Because we are magnificent creatures. As Yoda would say it, skin you are not, light beings you are. He actually said that. So I'm sure you're noticing a theme today of releasing and letting go and courage, having the courage to forgive and to move on. Or as Michael just sang, to make mistakes. We learn so much from our mistakes. We really are committed here to creating a culture where we encourage mistakes. Because if you're making a mistake, it means you're trying something new. It means you're taking risks. You're stepping out onto that cliff and expecting the bridge to appear. So I promise you, on tape, being recorded, that it is perfectly okay here to make mistakes. And in fact, you will be rewarded for making mistakes. Can we hear an amen for that? All right. We're also not going to get stuck in yesterday. We're going to forgive, we're going to forget, and we're going to move ahead. Hopefully in that order. So as I was thinking about what I wanted to talk about this morning, given the day, I mean, this is a huge day for our country. It's the 10th anniversary of 9/11, and it's the first Sunday of our new life together. It felt a little overwhelming. 9/11 is arguably one of the worst days in American history. It has been referred many times to our generation's Pearl Harbor. It's interesting because that helped me to understand my father's generation's feelings about that day. You know, for me, it was a history lesson, and it was meaningful, and it was a great movie. But when 9/11 happened, I got it. I understood the trauma, the feeling of being assaulted unexpectedly out of the blue, and the helplessness and the hopelessness that came with that. So it's a big day. It's also a big day for us, for this community, and that's a very happy thing. That's a joyous thing. It's a dream come true. And at the same time, the last 6 months has been somewhat of a roller coaster for many of us. I don't think that's too much of an understatement, both personally and professionally. So how do we reconcile all of that? How can we be with all of those feelings, the grief, remembering that sad day from 10 years ago, and juxtapose it beside the joy of today and the culmination of a dream? So as I was thinking about that, I was remembering one of my very favorites from Khalil Gibran, another master who may one day show up on one of our pedestals, when he taught, "Your joy is your sorrow unmasked, and how else can it be? For the deeper that sorrow carves into your being, the more joy you can contain. Is not the cup that holds your wine the very cup that was burned in the potter's oven?" And so that kept coming up for me this week as I watched all the 9/11 specials and documentaries. And what impressed me over and over again wasn't just the sadness of the stories, but the hope. Because every special, every conversation, every show ended with expressions of hope. Yes, they railed and they cried and they grieved and they talked about the unfairness of it all. I listened as a wife of one of the passengers on Flight 93 said that she held the phone after the crash until the battery went dead. Because as long as she could hear the static, she could hope that her husband was alive. That's grief. And yet that same woman is now remarried and has children and is happy. So there is hope. Many communities now even take 9/11 as a day to encourage and to cultivate community service and reaching out and helping others. So a day of tragedy is being turned into a day of hope and of community. Last night, Ken and I watched a special about a photographer, an amazing woman who went to Ground Zero after 9/11 and photographed all the responders, all the people from both New York City and people from all over the country and the world that came to Ground Zero to help clean up the mess and the rubble. And they showed picture after picture that she had taken of people and how dangerous it was. This was such dangerous work that the workers had to write on their arms with a marker their full names and a contact telephone number, so that if they were injured or rendered unconscious during the cleanup, they would know who they were and be able to get them assistance. That's how dangerous the cleanup was in all this unstable rubble while the fires were still burning. And so she took pictures of them. And so the documentary that we saw was of 10 years later. She wanted to look up all these people she had photographed. She had an amazing book that she had put together of them. And so she traveled around the country tracking down all these people that she had photographed and asking them how the last 10 years of their life had unfolded. And the stories were amazing. There was a firefighter who still struggled, who still had nightmares from 9/11. There was a woman who had so moved on that she was actually surprised by the feelings that came up for her in the interview. She didn't realize they were still there, buried after 10 years. There was a young woman who was only 16 at the time, and her stepfather was the head of the Port Authority. And that was a very interesting conversation that she had as a 26-year-old now, 10 years later, reliving that day. In the end, the photographer realized that they'd all moved on, each in their own way and each differently. Each had coped very differently, but they had all moved on, even the firefighter who struggled. At the very end of the interview, he lit up in joy as he shared with the photographer that he and his wife were expecting their first child. Even he had found joy in the moving on. But one of the most meaningful moments for me of the documentary was when they interviewed the photographer herself. And they asked her what the experience had been, being with all of the cleanup crews from all over the country, meeting all of them, photographing them, becoming very close to a particular group from Massachusetts. You could not be unattended at Ground Zero. It was too dangerous. And so they had attached her to a group of responders from Massachusetts that had become like family to her. And so they interviewed her at the end, and they said, "What was it like for you? What was your takeaway from that experience?" And she got very quiet, and she started to cry. And she said, "I experienced then a depth of sorrow I have never felt in my life, and I hope to never experience it again." And again, I was reminded that our joy is our sorrow unmasked, and that the deeper that sorrow carves into us, the greater receptacles we can be for joy. So like other traumatic events in our history, we talk about Pearl Harbor and we talk about the day that JFK died. Many of us remember exactly where we were on that day, as if it were yesterday. I was working in a theater in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and I was also attending the new seminary in New York City as a distance student. And so I remember that morning panicked because I couldn't find my friends. As soon as we saw what was happening, Ken and I feverishly started calling all of our friends in New York City, and we couldn't get through to anyone. Remember that day when all the lines were jammed and they came on TV and said, "Please stop trying to call people in New York City." which of course we all promptly ignored. And we're desperately trying to get through to our friends. I remember attending class less than 2 weeks later, and my family was saying to me, "You've got to be crazy. You